Hi, it's George from Any Old Music. Today we're going to be taking a look at Mozart's 21st Violin Sonata in E minor, K.304. Over on Any Old Music I discussed the context of the piece, what was going on in Mozart's life at the time, things like that, what sort of influenced the piece, more personally perhaps. For the video though, today I thought I'd just focus on the compositional techniques in the piece and discuss them. What I found interesting taking a look at the music. So yeah, Mozart's Violin Sonata in E minor. It has two movements, a sonato allegro and a minuet and trio. Two movement sonatas of this period were not unusual. While sonata form was perpetually developing, these were its formative years. Just as the symphony through the classical period was sort of transitioning from 3 movements to 4, the sonata was going through a similar change in that it was moving from a kind of 2 movement schema to 3. This sonata is one of the last ones that Mozart actually composed in 2 movements. He experiments with the 3 movement schema with piano sonatas composed around a similar period of time. In this analysis I want to focus on the first movement. I believe there are some valuable concepts that can still be learned from this older piece of music for us composers and arrangers. Particularly, I think, the presentation and control of musical ideas. Mozart's very good at sort of giving us a simple theme and presenting it really straightforwardly to us, and then taking it on a bit of an adventure in a way that we can sort of still recognise it. So that's kind of the satisfaction of Mozart's music, I guess. So for this analysis I want to pay particular attention to the structure of the first movement, how Mozart orders his ideas and presents them within the larger sonata schema. I also want to look at how he develops his themes, and particularly how he uses like fragmentation in creating quite, not dense polyphonic textures, quite straightforward ones still, but they've got some nuance underneath the surface. As I've suggested, the structure of K.304 is a broader sonata procedure. A form, as I've said, that is in sort of flux at this time. It's still possible to distinguish functional sections within the violin sonata that we are familiar with today. So for instance, the work has a clear exposition where Mozart communicates the thematic material to his audience. He then has a development section which, holds the bulk of the thematic variation. Although in reality, the development section is quite a confusing term, because you still get periods of melodic development and things like that in other parts of sonatas. Particularly in this one we get some interesting stuff appearing in bridge sections, transition sections. Thinking about tonality, it was aesthetic for this period to use closely related keys, and that's what Mozart does. On a larger scale, Mozart follows a typical modulatory schema for sonata form. The work starts, as I've said in the exposition, in the key of E minor. For the second subject he then moves into the relative major of G, and then for the development he moves again into the dominant minor, B minor. A typical strategy of this time, many works including sonata form movements start in the home key, modulating elsewhere through middle sections of the composition, usually to, as I've said, the relative dominant key or relative major, which is what Mozart does. Including smaller scale modulations, if we look at the circle of fifths, we can more easily see the closeness of all the keys Mozart uses in his work. To distinguish the larger scale modulations, I use red circles. For the smaller passive modulations, I use blue circles. In combination with the structural breakdown, the second subject and development sections are where the work stays within these different keys for the longest period of time. It is in the transition section where we have passages that pass through many keys quickly, but in so doing we travel the furthest from the home key of E minor. The most distant modulation, which we can see on the circle of fifths, is between G major and G minor, which is a parallel modulation between major and minor. Despite being visually more distant though, the fact that the two are parallel tonalities means that they share the same root and core sort of some important harmonic tones. For example, Mozart actually uses a D pedal through this passage to both underpin the G minor and also build excitement towards the impending G major. D is the dominant of both G minor and G major. Along with modulations, Mozart also uses texture to create interest and clarity in this thematic material. That's similar to how, Giroux also uses texture to create quick variations on Bizet's Farandole. Melody and accompaniment is the most prominent texture of the composition of Mozart's composition now. Mozart also uses polyphony and homophony, although the latter he uses more sparingly. Homophony actually appears more within a kind of melody and accompaniment texture, so you'll often have sort of a melody and then chordal harmony underneath that moves in its own pace. To me, the opening monophonic texture of violin and piano in octave unisons is a startling opening, especially when mixed with the piano dynamic level and brooding minor tonality. This response could, in large part, be due to Mozart's larger output of works. We often expect him to have quite upbeat major tonality pieces. It's a stark contrast within the larger context of his catalogue of works. Mozart uses monophony, or more frequently melody and accompaniment, in sections where initial thematic statements or restatements happen. In these passages, the accompaniment part switches between two forms. Firstly, broken chord Alberti bass figurations, or secondly, chordal statements, reminiscent of homophony. Like I've said, they're sort of chords within a larger melodic melody and accompaniment texture. Mozart also uses two forms of polyphony in this composition, canon and imitative counterpoint. In the passages that I label as codettas, Mozart presents the first theme of the first subject in a two-part canon. It was this textural distinction, along with its positioning just before sort of important transitions, before repeat marks in the piece, that I decided, I was going to call it a codetta. I don't think it's an accident that there is a correlation between, exposition, restatement, and the use of melody and accompaniment textures, or monophony, while, he reserves polyphony for transitional and developmental sections. Melody and accompaniment textures inherently elevate the prominence of melody. In stating his themes, Mozart wants us to be able to identify them, hear them. The satisfaction of the sonata form from a listener's perspective, particularly in this period, is being able to hear these themes and then spot them in more complex settings. In other words, as the composer, Mozart wants us to identify his themes so he can show us how clever he is in developing them later on. Thematically, I've already alluded to two ways in which Mozart develops his material. One of these is through modulation, taking his themes through different keys. Another is through setting them in different textures. These changes are broader, with Mozart imposing the challenge of fitting each idea into a new tonal or textural context. However, Mozart also uses a smaller scale development technique known as fragmentation. I want to highlight this technique now by extracting the original melodies and some of these developments and demonstrating them here. The first theme that Mozart presents is a lyrical bel canto style melody. With the Anacrusis, it spans 8 bars. The second 4-bar phrase of this 8-bar melody is most important in the development section, as we'll see, while its opening arpeggio figure is something that I've likened to a Mannheim rocket for reasons that are evident in the contextual analysis that I haven't discussed here. Its inner contours are largely upward, but on a larger scale it's always falling back to where it started. The first theme of the second subject has two distinguishing characteristics. The first is its emphasis on dotted rhythmic patterns, followed secondly by its V-shaped contour. The dotted rhythms are particularly important to developments of this theme within the transitional sections of the work, while the descending straight quaver passage and octave leap become important in the development section of the composition. The second subject theme has the most smaller scale developments. In the transitional sections of the exposition and recapitulation, we can extract several iterations of the dotted rhythm fragmented from the theme. In the development section, Mozart uses larger fragments of the themes, placing them in counterpoint. The use of the first theme per subject is clear, as it appears first in full form. The only apparent change initially is its transposition into the key of B minor. Mozart then fragments this theme, focusing on the second 4-bar phrase, counterpointing it with both itself and a fragment of the second subject. The second subject's use is less obvious. Mozart fragments the second portion of this theme, where the melody descends in straight rather than dotted quavers. He then alters the rhythm while maintaining the intervallic and contour features. Placing the extracts together with annotations demonstrates the second subject's use in this section of the composition. Placing the themes in a different texture is a large-scale way of developing the material. Mozart can extract larger fragments, juxtaposing them to create a compelling moment of polyphony. All the while, he's not reinventing the wheel, he's using materials that he's exposed to us already, what we've already heard, and what is already readily available to him. I always think of sonata, or any established form for that matter, as being like a species of animal. Similar forms have underlying skeletons that might be indiscernible beyond species alone. However, when you give them their form, adding the flesh, skin and hair, if it's fortunate enough to have any, the variety becomes much more vast. We can identify individual people or animals through, their appearance, just as we can identify different pieces. However, if you take a look under the surface, the structures can be very similar. Thinking about the similarity of the underlying structure but the difference of outer form, the first broader takeaway is one of exploration. Why not explore established forms in your writing? Mozart, in my opinion, was an exceptional exploiter of form, creating novelty within its confines. I think this is also why his music has entered and remains firmly within the Western musical classical canon, whatever your opinions and takes are on that. In using forms, he makes his music more accessible. We understand his music more immediately. As a result, we can obviously appreciate it a lot more easily. Now, appreciation might not be an aesthetic goal, and I'm not saying it should be, but it's a concept that is helpful to be aware of. On a smaller level, Mozart's E minor sonata demonstrates techniques we can try and apply in our work, even if we dress it up differently. For example, while we might not want to use many 1-5 relationships, dominant and tonic relationships that is, we can certainly use texture and melodic fragmentation to develop our musical ideas, refreshing them for our listeners. In your next composition or arrangement, why not try counterpointing fragments of your melody in a small passage of your work? Why not use a texture that you use less frequently in your work at an important point in that composition? Perhaps the beginning, as Mozart does here, taking your listeners by surprise. If you've enjoyed this video, then subscribe, click the little bell icon, like, and give us some feedback or questions below in the comment section. I've been George Marshall at Any Old Music. I hope to see you again soon. Thanks for watching.